Hello, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. My name is Erica Pothig, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer and Vice President of the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first in a series of discussions this week on the equity imperative. I'd like to first thank all of our panelists and audience members for joining us today, and thank the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for their collaboration in today's event, this week's series, and the Accelerating Innovation for Inclusion initiative. Over the past year, support from the MasterCard Impact Fund has enabled Urban to conduct a series of research projects focused on the ways in which technology is transforming city services, and specifically how new technologies might help cities achieve equity goals, or on the contrary, exacerbate existing inequities. Our discussions this week will explore how the public, private, and nonprofit sectors can not only bridge this divide, but ensure that technological advances promote equity in cities. These conversations are happening against a backdrop of pain and protest about the violence that has been perpetrated against Black people across the United States in the past week and for hundreds of years. The killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by local police, Ahmaud Arbery's violent shooting by neighbors to which prosecutors turned a blind eye, and the way Amy Cooper weaponized her white privilege are manifestations of racist systems and institutions that have existed since the birth of this country. Urban was founded in 1968, a year of great progress and great sorrow. Our founding purpose was to evaluate the Great Society programs that aim to end poverty and racial injustice. But we remain a long way from that vision today. At Urban, we are striving to use evidence to illuminate the ways policies and systems undergird institutionalized racism and develop tools and evidence-based strategies to create systemic change and greater racial equity. We try to help those driving toward racial justice and equity hold institutions and their leaders accountable with the facts and evidence, disaggregating the data to reveal whom policies serve and whom they fail, and where interventions and remedies reach, and which approach makes the most difference. In this moment, decades of generating evidence about inequities seems inadequate and insufficient to address racialized violence and create systemic change. Evidence such as this provide us with a platform, elevate individuals' voices and organizations working towards racial equity across the nation, and to affirm that Black lives matter. Today's program focuses on the role of technology in the inclusive city. As we've seen in the last few weeks and years, the role of technology, specifically phones and video recording, have brought racist actions into the public eye in ways that were not possible 10 years ago. These actions always existed, but because of technology, they've been made more visible. And as a result, our systems and behaviors must also be more accountable. At the same time, technologies like facial recognition and predictive policing can exacerbate over-policing in Black communities when they are used inequitably. No technology can overcome deep-seated systemic racism, but our program today will highlight how cities are working to employ technologies in ways that intentionally address disparities and create more inclusive cities. Thank you for joining us in a time I know many are having difficulty finding bandwidth. Our panelists are proof that cities can set equity and inclusion goals around digital inclusion and meaningfully work towards them. I'm going to turn it over to Elena Stern, who will introduce our panel conversations and our panelists. Elena is a data science fellow at the Urban Institute, studying policy solutions to advance equity and inclusion in cities. Previously, she worked at AData and the Center for Data Science and Public Policy. Elena, pleased to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Erica. As Erica mentioned, my name is Elena Stern and I'm a data science fellow at the Urban Institute. And I'm excited to be moderating today's discussion. I'd like to join Erica in thanking all of our panelists and audience members for joining us today, and echo her thanks of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for their collaboration in today's event, this week's series, and the Accelerating Innovation for Inclusion initiative. Before we begin, I'd like to very quickly go through some quick housekeeping items. First, the event will be recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. All participants will be muted during the event. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them at the end. You're also welcome to comment or upvote on questions that others send. And lastly, we encourage you to interact with us online using the hashtag #InnovateForInclusiveGrowth. Our research under the Accelerating Innovation for Inclusion program has explored the role of technology in the inclusive city across diverse domains, from economic development and transportation to benefits delivery and micromobility. One common theme that has emerged from our research across these domains is that without an intentional focus on equity and inclusion in the use of technology, the digital revolution in cities is likely to exacerbate divides. We've seen many such examples, from facial recognition software that is more likely to misidentify the gender of individuals with dark skin, to algorithmic decision systems that can reinforce bias, to smart infrastructure, which is not accessible to individuals with disabilities. And the fact that in 2018, over 30% of households in 221 US cities lacked broadband internet, which disproportionately includes low-income individuals and people of color. When we began planning this series in late 2019, we wanted to make sure we started the forum with a conversation to ground our audience in a shared understanding of why cities must consider equity, as more and more services are digitized and data and technology are integrated into nearly all facets of governance. As we come together today, the importance of putting equity at the center of city use of technology is startlingly clear. Against a backdrop of pain and protest at the violence perpetrated against Black people in the United States and the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by local police, we must examine how the inequitable application of surveillance technology and algorithmic systems can accelerate the over-policing and unjust treatment of Black communities. And the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the daily realities of technological inequality. Access to technology determines one's ability to work, access services, educate themselves and their children, and obtain vital information about COVID-19 prevalence, policy, and testing. And as cities move to rapidly roll out online or digitized service and expand access to technology in the face of the pandemic, it is critical that equity be at the heart of technology programs. So what has our research shown about what it will take for technology to be a driver of the inclusive city, rather than a force to exacerbate divides? Our research has shown that this process starts with building a shared definition of equity with residents and across city departments, and creating a formal process to apply that definition to the design, deployment, and evaluation of technology programs. Before deploying new technology, we found that cities should rigorously examine the potential unintended harms by asking what or who the technology optimizes for and who could be disproportionately harmed or excluded. For example, our research found that investments in new benefit delivery technology and contactless cards and mobile payment systems for transportation can exclude those without access to the internet or bank accounts. Cities should maintain high-quality options that are accessible to those populations while investing in addressing these underlying structural disparities. This will involve working creatively with private and nonprofit partners to close the digital divide and expand access to banking services so that all individuals can equitably benefit from new technologies. Tomorrow's session in our series will explore how to ensure mutual accountability in such public-private partnerships. We learned that part of this examination should include investing in research and development around emerging technologies to build impact before scaling, especially when those technologies will be used by vulnerable populations. We learned that community engagement that centers the voice of the most impacted and too often disenfranchised should be at the heart of identifying how technology can be used to address resident needs and defining the terms of success. Thursday's session in our series will explore how to plan with and not for those communities. And we heard that it is key for cities to implement data collection and governance strategies which protect resident privacy while collecting sufficiently disaggregated data to understand disparities and measure progress towards equity goals. As cities grapple with how to address the technology inequities that have been laid bare by COVID-19 and look ahead to the role of technology in enabling an inclusive recovery, these equity principles and our conversation today are incredibly timely. I'm thrilled to be joined by 3 individuals who are leading these efforts in their cities. As I introduce their panelists, I'll invite them to turn on their cameras. Our panelists' full bios are available online and also will be posted in the chat box. First, Gary Brantley is the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Atlanta Information Management. Majestic Lane serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer for Pittsburgh Mayor William Peduto. And Lori Nelson is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston. Thank you all again so much for being here today and for taking the time out to be with us. As I mentioned earlier, our research has revealed that in order for equity to be considered in decision-making, that first a shared definition of equity is needed. Majestic, I'd love to ask you to start us off and sharing how your office has been involved with efforts to build a shared definition of equity in Pittsburgh.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Really appreciate it, especially in these times. As we're going through so much, I think the national conversation around technology and equity couldn't be in a more appropriate conversation. So for us, we knew, as equity became more of a conversation, and we started to see, like you see in a lot of cities, the conversation around a tale of 2 cities, if you will, those who are doing really well and those who are not. We started to realize that equity was often in the eye of the beholder, right? Like some people would perceive something as equitable and some people wouldn't. So in our process, we kind of went through a long way of kind of figuring out what it meant to us. And what we really came back to was the definition utilized by GARE, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which really speaks to the fact that race should not be a stand-in for quality of life. Gender should not be a stand-in for quality of life, right? When you really are able to see that if I say someone lives in this neighborhood, I shouldn't be able to identify how long they're going to live. I shouldn't be able to identify their median income. And it shouldn't be 50% lower than someone in the zip code or the central block next to them, right? So we really have gone back to that. And what that has done is level set for us is having to look at what are the numbers and then say, what are the things that we can do from a program, policy, and procedural perspective to be able to ameliorate those and accelerate the good things, ameliorate the issues to be able to make it as such. So for us, it is a very simple definition that provides a very good base and level sets for us.
Thanks, Majestic. And I like what you said, how sort of equity can be in the eye of the beholder without these shared definitions, which are so key. And Lori, I'd love to ask you to build on Majestic's comments and talk about how your office has been working to build a shared definition of equity in Boston, and also thinking about the role of local history and context in building a Boston-specific definition of equity.
So thank you for having me today. Thank you to my colleagues who are on the panel. I want to suggest that when the office was put together, the goal was to figure out, both from a historical space and where the city of Boston was currently looking at equity and race matters, how that mixes, how that matches, right? How that comes together. I think at that time, what was clear was that Boston had gone through painful and some very telling stories of our history as Black and Brown people, but that there was a need to really consider what that looks like and to take accountability and ownership of where we were at that particular time, and then come up with a strategy that would help us advance and move forward, recognizing again that there is ownership, recognizing again that persons had to deal with their own reflection, if you will. What roles have I played, or the generations that came before me, or the persons who serve in different capacities of leadership? How did or how does this play into where we are now as it relates to equity? And as we advance forward in this current day and time, it's very clear that equity is still at the heart of the matter, right? It's very clear that equity and our conversations around equity are conversations about the haves and have-nots, our conversations around how we ensure that everybody gets to be not only participants, as in to join the table and eat at the table, but have a voice at the table. And so that's where we are now.
Thank you, Lori. And Gary, I'd love to hear your perspective leading the Department of Atlanta Information Management. How has your team department worked with Atlanta's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion to sort of bring and ground that shared definition of equity in your office's specific work?
Yeah, good afternoon. I just want to say that this is at the heart of what the mayor for the city of Atlanta is focusing on, right? And so everything that we had to look at with this new administration changed from us really being super tech focused on advancements that were going into the community to really making sure that we were concentrating on our populations that needed it most. And one of the things that we've been doing to work with the Office of Equity and Inclusion is to really focus on making sure that our community has a voice. We hear it a lot, but we also want to make sure that they're at the table from the beginning. And it's very important to understand we made a very intentional focus to really understand our communities at its core. Not just seeing that things are missing from the community or seeing where there's gaps. I mean, really, truly understanding what the community needs and wants, and then really starting to build that out, not bringing them in at the end. And we've been working extremely hard on that. And even as we start to put the technology into communities, we're careful about making sure that we are not scaring our population as well. Some of these devices are extremely intimidating. They're not easily understood. And if you don't have, you're not on the same level playing field from an educational background, from a resource background, you really won't have the opportunity to really understand what is actually being placed in your community to help you. And so those are some of the areas that we really have been intentional about in the city of Atlanta.
Thanks, Gary. And yeah, what you were saying about really understanding communities and making sure they have a seat at the table, and specifically at the beginning of the process, not just at the end, is so vital. And I know something we'll be digging into more in Thursday's session. I want to ask, not just having a shared definition of equity, but also how can you actually measure progress against that shared definition? And one thing we found in our research is without the shared definition, cities are unable to really effectively measure progress and have that sort of shared baseline and understanding. And Majestic, this makes me think, of course, of the great work Pittsburgh is doing with the Pittsburgh Equity Indicators to address this challenge. And so I'd love to ask you to talk about that work and some of the metrics and data that your team is using to understand how Pittsburgh is advancing towards its equity goals.
Sure. As part of our work with the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities, we were, kind of working towards understanding our shocks and stressors. And as we came to understand our shocks and stressors, one of the big things that came out was that white supremacy and racism was just a continual stressor on the system, right? And this is things that people already know, we can eyeball, but when we did the research, we actually saw that this was something that there will be shocks that are occurring, like we see with COVID, like we see happening right now with George Floyd and protests and insurrections, civil unrest across the country. That those are just shocks to a system that have already had this constant stressor. So once we came with that, and that was a unique thing that, you know, I think that the mayor was able to see, then we started to dig a little deeper and say, well, what are the present challenges? We know that a lot of cities have some similar challenges, but what are the clear and distinct challenges that Pittsburgh has that we need to be able to work on? So as part of that work, we started engaging with four of the cities in America on really trying to get to the core of our equity indicators and what could we use. And so we went through a process with CUNY, the City University of New York, to really start to look at, let's measure a lot of stuff and now let's figure out what are the largest things. So we actually went through about 80 indicators. And then of the 80 indicators, we identified the 5 that were the largest and most presenting. And, you know, those are very similar to what one may imagine in a lot of places. Homicides between Black and white, amount of young people who are in the CYF services, the population that are unbanked, asthma, and also infant mortality and maternal mortality. And some of those things were primary. Some of those things we're secondary on, as far as, because we have a city-county structure where the county, Allegheny County, has the health department in the Children, Youth, and Families department. But we identified that through our place-based work, that we could do some 2-generation work and 2-generation models that would allow us to start working on how can we be beneficial around the health disparities, and could we make sure that we're for.
Majestic, I think you're on mute.
Okay, am I back?
Back.
Yeah, apartment call came in. If we could do that, we could start to identify what we can be primary on and what could be secondary. And actually what we were able to do then is roll out a whole suite of activities based on what we saw with those. So it's really guided us and given us a thing of, we know that everything is an issue, but if, you know, the saying, if everything is an issue, nothing's an issue. So, you know, we wanted to be able to drill down and then measure over time if we're making strides, if our activities are making strides, what's changing in the environment, and then be able to pivot. So it's actually making us much more strategic in identifying what are some of the larger issues impacting our community and how and what can we do around it. So it's been really important to level set for the entire community with this level of data.
Thanks, Majestic. And yeah, I think what you were saying, if everything's an issue, nothing's an issue, and that approach of taking, you know, a broad aperture, measuring a lot of things to identify the most, you know, important disparities is an excellent example of how data and measuring progress towards equity goals can really drive action. Lori, I know Boston is doing a lot of great work in this arena with Resilient Boston, and I'd love to hear how your office is approaching sort of measuring progress towards those equity goals for the city.
Sure. Similar to where Majestic spoke of, and around the 100 resilient cities, certainly want to credit them for not only helping us to do the unique type of resilient strategy in Boston, but their ongoing work, and as it is morphed now into a different entity, the continued work around figuring out how we get this right and how we move it forward. I would suggest that for us, Boston also prides on partnerships. And so as it relates to some of the data analysis and the way by which we are informed around data, around how to disaggregate data, and certainly how to look at data by way of moving things forward through policy and procedure, what we have found is that some of the unique partnerships with some of the educational institutions here in the city of Boston have proved very, very good for us. You know, persons who are eager to look at data sets, persons who are eager to study what has worked in Boston and its history and what can work currently and in the future by way of proposals and recommendations. And so that has been a very good tool for us. In addition, I am very pleased to have to be a part of an administration that recognizes that we have to look at this through the lens of where we are now and how we move forward. There's a wonderful part of our organization called the Urban Mechanics, and the Urban Mechanics are unique to us because they literally look at every type of data set. They look at everything and come up with plans and strategies, not only for now, but the future. These are young people who are eager to figure out how Boston becomes better. They are eager to figure out those places where Boston has suffered and is suffering, again, related to equity and equal access for Black and Brown people. And certainly they look into very forward-thinking recommendations, sometimes very out the box, which we appreciate as well, to help us consider how we move it forward. So that's how Boston has been, and certainly with my office, leaning on these entities to help us. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention certainly the great work of our internal team of our IT department, headed by a gentleman who hails from DC and came to us probably around 2 years ago with an understanding of equity deep within his soul. And so it has been a wonderful mix of these different technological minds, if you will, in addition to the mindsets of those in education and those who are really, really poised to help us look at some cutting edge work through the urban mechanics work.
Thank you, Lori. So Lori and Majestic have both spoke about the data that cities are successfully collecting. Gary, I'd like to ask you to speak to some of the challenges around sort of using data to plan with equity at the center. And one thing we've heard in our research is that a real limitation on centering equity in decision-making can be insufficient data. For example, in the realm of transportation, we heard metro regions needed more data to understand how population and housing shifts were impacting transportation access to plan more equitably. So for your office, are there challenges in collecting sufficient data or sufficiently disaggregated data or sort of missing data or sources that would help you better plan with equity at the forefront?
Yeah, very, very good question, and a very unique challenge that we face with that across the board. And I will tell you that, especially for cities, and in some cases, government entities, even including state and federal in some cases, we have a real hard time, what I would say, really understanding the data that we have. We have pockets of data located all across the city. I believe Lori spoke not only the city, the state, and county, and I believe Lori spoke a little bit about really understanding or the educational aspect of it, right? And so our partners are really key to getting a lot of this done. I think some of the challenges we face, and we just look at it from the technical side of things, is really data privacy is huge. We have to be really careful around what it is that we're putting out there. We also need to make sure that it's secure and that our residents understand that we have it. I think as we're collecting it, they really need to be informed about that process and what actually goes into that. I think on the other end, what we're struggling with is really having true data scientists within the city that can make rhyme and reason for what it is that we're bringing in to make really good decisions. I think the data is a lot of the data is there. We just our challenge is bringing it all together to formulate one holistic picture across the city. That's what I have not seen, and that's also tied into how can you tie in how you operate as a city to determine where your focus is around the inequities that exist in your community. We have great programs that we're tied in with Georgia Tech, also tied in. We have around data specifically and reading data sets. Also, we made a shift most recently and really started to provide those types of programs for our HBCUs. Specifically working on a program that we're getting ready to start with Spelman, just really around bringing young females, young ladies into these particular situations and circumstances. So I also think we need to be a lot more diverse around the people that we actually bring in to take a look at this data. I think that can be extremely challenging as well.
Yeah, I think all excellent points. And Gary, if I may ask you a follow-up question, you mentioned, of course, the import of data privacy. And I think especially in this moment as we're thinking about the ways that data can drive response to COVID-19, whether that's contact tracing or measuring sort of adherence to social distancing. Of course, data privacy concerns are at the forefront. And I'd love to hear how your office is thinking about those issues and what sort of data governance solutions you're thinking about to ensure that data is used responsibly and protecting resident privacy.
That's correct. We've been working a lot with that through policy. Internally, I think the first thing we needed to do as an organization is really have a true intentional focus on the policies internally around the data that we're collecting, and to also make sure that the policies that the city is putting forth is actually recognized and understood by the communities that are being affected by it. And so that was first and foremost what we needed to look at first as an organization to get our act together. As it relates to, we've stood up a lot of applications in the last few weeks. And one of the areas that we're focusing on that may not have direct relevance to this conversation, but has a lot of relevance is the security around it. As you know, there are a lot of them, and what most people don't really understand, even when you're having these protests that are taking place outside, there's also a back end kind of protest going on with our systems. And so really making sure that that they're being attacked as well. It doesn't get a lot of press, but they are. And so one of the things that we're working on is making sure that we have the proper security in place that protects our residents from the data that we're collecting so it's not exposed irresponsibly. And so those are other areas that we're focusing on as it relates to data privacy.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And you've been a leader on data security issues in Atlanta, so it's great reflection. Lori, I'd love to ask you to reflect on sort of another potential challenge around data use, which is that sometimes you might have data, but we know that there are issues with marginalized populations being underrepresented in data sources. And that can lead to those communities being underserved by city programs when that data is used to drive sort of service provision and decision making. I know Boston's Streetcaster program is a great example of how cities can respond to this bias in data. And I'd love for you to talk about that program and how the city of Boston is approaching this challenge.
So I think, thank you for that question. Pardon me. The Streetcaster program came in the first installation of our resilience strategy. And what was clear, it was a both and approach. So whereas we were able to collect the data sets that, like I outlined to you, come with educational partners and come with some of the wonderful tools that at the time were shared and outlined through the work of 100 Resilient Cities. What we recognized is that there had to be a more granular approach. There had to be another way to get and collect accurate data in a timely manner. And so people began to figure out ways to literally survey and capture data by way of going out to communities that we serve. It's not one of those aha moments, but it's almost like as we look at how we try to set and create policy, as we try to look at data that we hope and pray represents the people we serve. We also figure out and know that we have to hear from the people. And so Streetcaster, along with other programs, use the both and approach, whereas they certainly are data analysts and are very well versed in that space. There was also a need to combine what the data was showing or was not showing, to your point, Elena, and then match it with what was actually happening and going on the ground. And so that program, amongst others, is how we begin to look at trying to capture data and data sets that in as much as we can represent the totality of the communities that we serve.
Thank you, Lori. And yeah, I like your framing of the both and approach to capture the totality of communities, whereas one data source might underrepresent or only partially reflect that totality. That both and is really critical. We recently conducted a survey of chief technology officers in the United States, trying to understand how their departments were using technology in the response to COVID-19. And one thing that we heard clearly was that the pandemic has catalyzed digital inclusion and literacy efforts in some cities as the sort of importance of access to technology becomes clearer than ever. And one respondent noted that in light of COVID-19, that digital access and literacy is literally a matter of life and death. And Majestic, I'd love to ask you to talk about sort of what the pandemic has brought to light about the digital divide in Pittsburgh and how the city has been speeding up efforts to increase access for residents.
Well, thank you. A couple things that we've done to recognize this. I would say that prior Mayor Peduto has really championed the idea of digital equity and digital access and digital education as important things. We have, University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, which are leading in so many things around tech and automation and everything and artificial intelligence. And it's really important to make sure that those places are not just citadels of information that sit amongst a broader city that folks don't have access. So we were already in the process of converting many of our rec centers really into what we call rec to tech. Came from the Obama administration, but really continuing on with that process and doing deep investment in communities around that process. What we realized here, what has happened is that is more important than ever to be able to make that make sense. So one of the examples that we have is our summer youth employment program. So we know that, now more than ever, young people having access to resources and access to money, frankly, is more important than ever, right? Due to COVID. But we also know that just due to the reality of the virus, that you can't have a lot of people together and you can't have the traditional jobs that young people may have done. So I literally just got an email that our Workforce Investment Board, Partner for Work, has invested in hundreds of Chromebooks to be able to give to young people, to be able to partner with us to make sure that they still have a job experience and still learn job skills this summer. And also, Partner for Work in the city is supporting a project with PPS, Pittsburgh Public Schools, around making sure that all 8th and 9th graders have access to a work experience, and Pittsburgh Public Schools is investing in Chromebooks as well. So we're really trying to move fast. Bureaucracies usually don't move this fast to be able to get something done on behalf of people, especially. But this is an example we've had to pivot really fast around technology, acknowledging that. And the third way, I'll give examples. It's a small example, but especially now, there's so many challenges going on with housing, and we know that it's going to be an avalanche starting very soon around evictions and things like that. So one thing we did was create a website, a housing website that you could go on, and whatever issue and challenge you may have, it could populate it and direct you to the place where you needed to go. Right. And so that's good for us, because if someone has access now, they have access to every program that the city, that the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and that the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh has. So that way, if you get access to that, you now have access to being able to get the help that you need, when before you'd have to go sit in a place or you'd have to call and be on the line. So we want to be able to cut that and be able to get things directly to people as fast as we could. So we've had to really pivot and understand this. And it's been a good experience, because it's shown that under unique circumstances, we can pivot and we can cut bureaucracy to be able to get things to who needs it.
Thank you, Majestic. I appreciate you sharing the ways that bureaucracy is figuring out how to move quickly in Pittsburgh, and discussing the different dimensions where the digital divide intersects with access to opportunities, education, housing, all these different dimensions. Gary, I'd love you to share how your team has been working to accelerate efforts to close the digital divide in response to COVID-19.
Yeah, that has pretty much been, as soon as I walked into the community of Atlanta, probably about 10 years ago, before this job, I was a CIO of one of the largest school districts in the country. And so equity and using technology has been the focus of that. And so bringing that over to the city of Atlanta is where the work is continuing. And so with this, one of the things that we really are focusing on and have focused on is partnering with large organizations such as Microsoft, such as Amazon, AT&T, et cetera. And also just recently with Sprint, we were able to provide hundreds of access points to the Atlanta public school system for access. And they'll have those for free for the next several years. And so we've outlined locations. The city of Atlanta has about 18 or 19 centers of hope. And in those centers of hope, we wanted to reimagine those and really start to focus and put technology inside of those. So we've refreshed in the last 6 or 7 months every single one with the latest and greatest technology. We've reopened and reinvested through the money that we've gotten from some of our IT partners and put that money back into opening boys and girls clubs that were actually destroyed or not even destroyed, what I would say closed in certain communities where they were needed. And so that is going on. And as soon as we can get back together, we'll be having a ribbon cutting to really open that. So really excited about that. But I think the most important piece to add to that is the programming that's inside of that. When we start to look at that, the focus has really been on making sure that our underserved population comes out through these programs with true skill sets, not just, and those are the tough conversations that we've had to have with our partners like Microsoft. This isn't just, I don't want programming for how to use PowerPoint and just programming I want true programming in place that allows our residents to come out as cloud architect engineers. Let's get a little bit deeper into the work that needs to happen in order to equalize the playing field. And, those are deep conversations we've had. We just received hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of dollars from AT&T to go towards that type of work. And so we'll continue to focus on that. I have a big conversation that I'm excited about with Microsoft that's coming up in the next week or so. And if we can get this going, it will absolutely, I believe, change the whole mindset and concept around what equity really means as it relates to programming and skill sets.
Thank you, Gary. Lori, as the city of Boston is also working to quickly accelerate efforts to close the digital divide, what have been some of the biggest challenges that your team has encountered and how to ramp up that work to close the digital divide quickly?
So similar to my colleagues who have spoken, it is, so there are two things, right? So the first is the understanding and recognition of where people actually are in the digital divide, again, which requires research. It requires, like I said previously, the both and approach of boots on the ground to figure out, in certain populations or where, for example, in the city of Boston, they are wonderful and are partners in one of our quasis, but the Boston Housing Authority has, it's public housing and it's subsidized housing. And so ensuring that Boston public housing, ensuring that neighborhoods that historically have been either written in our history books the wrong way, or to the extent where persons are not able to access whatever that looks like for them, whether it be because of their socioeconomic status, whether it be because of other matters, and particularly as the COVID-19 hits, as we look at exactly what people need so that people can live. What we find is that our office, Do It, and other partners are working very hard to ensure that everyone gets access, and not only with access, to Gary's point, particularly, it's one thing to give people access, right? It's one thing to say, okay, we know you need a tool, so here's the tool. It's the other thing to teach and instruct, and then to use that tool to actually look at a situation where we are and really try to better ourselves, right? To look at different opportunities. And when we come out of a COVID, and when we continue to tackle these issues of race that are glaring in front of us, and as we continue to look to work together, how do we look at technology to help us do so? And so I am happy around the partners that we also have here in the city of Boston and the Commonwealth that help us to look at those spaces. I also believe it requires us to continue to advocate, right? Because it's where we are now, right? So what we're seeing across the nation is that people are tired, people are in unrest. And so how do we, in these unique roles that we play, continue to advocate in such a way so that people will have what they need, the tools, in order to survive and thrive as we, again, navigate through a COVID crisis and pandemic and navigate through where we are now as a nation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lori. Well, I have one more question, which I'll go around the horn and ask everyone to answer before we move to our Q&A session, which is one thing that's come out of our survey of chief technology officers is that there have been some ways in which these new changes to how cities are using technology in response to COVID-19 could be positive, whether that's, as Gary was mentioning, Lori mentioned, sort of new partnerships to expand access to devices and literacy, or new services altogether, like the Housing Assistance Resource Portal, which Majestic mentioned. And I guess reflecting on the ways in which city use of technology has changed in response to COVID-19, I'd like to ask each of you to share, are there any positive changes that you hope persist beyond the pandemic that could create a more equitable landscape as we look ahead to recovery? So Gary, I'll ask you to go first.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is coming out of this, as Majestic said, is we've been able to rapidly adopt quickly. And I think this, from the standpoint of not just technology, I'm seeing programs that are picking up pace just because of the situation that we're in. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is the partnership internally that we've created through what I would call my CIO advisory board. And so that's really important to me because we have some of the biggest CIOs in the country on that board that sit right here in Atlanta, and the focus is in equity. When we first had that board come in over a year ago, my focus to them, or my words to them, was, I don't want you to do my job. I want, let's, and that's the internal workings. Let's focus on the job you need to be a part of, which is outside in the community. And so what we're doing is finding commonalities across the board on what we all care about. We're using each other's systems and data sets to really come to a focus on what, like, our big focus right now is homeless and affordable housing, making sure we have the right infrastructure in place that's tied to the mayor's strategy on where we're buying housing. We want the infrastructure in place so we can have smart housing within the city of Atlanta. And so, programs like that, the development programs that I talked about earlier, are extremely exciting. But what's most exciting to me is the mindset to move faster. I've seen that in the last 30 days, and the internal rapid adoption of technology that is going to have a positive effect on what we do.
Thank you, Gary. Lori, I'd like to ask you to go next. Are there any sort of positive changes in how the city is using technology that you would like to persist beyond COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure, I would be, but I have to bring this to light. So let me start here. So that we recognize, and certainly the panelists recognize, and the audience recognizes that, a COVID-19 heightens everything, right? A COVID-19 brings an urgency with it, right? The current status of where we are as a nation brings an urgency with it, right? And so what I'm hoping for is that post a COVID-19 in particular, that the same energy, the same zeal, the same urgency that our partners in technology here in the city and in the Commonwealth, those internally and externally who are focused on cutting edge technology and new ways to partner with the city, new ways to educate our young people, new ways to look at digital platforms, all of these things that are now coming to the forefront, that they continue past COVID, right? So part of the work that we do here is really to try to ensure that by way of policy, right? By way of putting it into the spaces and places that impact the over 800,000 people that we serve in the city. And so for me, it is exciting when you have this unique moment to to instill and really make part of the fabric of who we are as a city by way of policy, by way of practice, right? By way of how we execute everything that we say that we are going to do around equity, particularly this being the digital equity divide component of it, that we are intentional on what that looks like after a crisis. And that again, by policy, policy wonk, but that by policy, these things will live past this time, and they will be really embedded in how we continue to frame, continue to move with our initiatives and our goals around bettering the city of Boston.
Great. Thank you, Lori. And Majestic, to you.
I'm going to echo the sentiments of my colleagues. I think one of the biggest things I've seen is, you know, when you're doing work, you're triangulating, right? Like when you're in, you know, the administration, you're trying to think about everybody. And, you know, when I think once everything gets kind of, the bandage gets ripped off, if you will, and things come to be, you really come to see the fragility of many people's lives and how many systems are put together to just keep people up in a basic social safety net that once it's challenged, you see what you have to do. So we've been able to really see it in a much more visceral way since COVID has began. And then obviously, even with some of our recent challenges with what's going on in cities and neighborhoods, we still having access and challenges in getting people access to resources when these things occur. So it's been open for, like, I think everyone's been able to see it, but we've been able to pivot much faster, make decisions much quicker, which I think is really important. And really important for going forward to say that this is the standard operating procedure now. That we see an issue, we have a challenge, we need to be thoughtful, but we need to make a decision, and especially make a decision for those who are most impacted and those who aren't often thought about with challenges that our cities see.
Absolutely. Thank you, Majestic. And we'll move to our Q&A section. Actually, Majestic, the first question is for you. So one of our attendees asked whether the Pittsburgh equity indicators are being updated to reflect COVID impacts on the city.
They will be. They are not right now, just because also the process of the equity indicator process is a number of months. So I think what we going to have to be able to do is really look at that data as we're coming out of this and be able to see it. But we do have resources identified to be able to do that. And one thing I will say is that one of what we began to see and kind of crowdsource, as well as information, that we knew that some of the larger challenges around food scarcity, some of the challenges that we knew around access to capital, and these things were coming in. And this was also part of the other information we had. We were able to get resources and our CARES resources to get it to it based on what we knew were present issues prior. And we're always looking for the unintended consequences of things that are occurring. So we do look for to have an update for that in the next coming months.
Great, thanks, Majestic.
Of the equity indicators.
Right, great. Next question, one of our attendees asked whether working with private actors such as Google or Microsoft to optimize data, and then what are the role and challenges of partnerships with the private sector for data analysis and public policy? So maybe Gary, I'd like to ask you to take that question first.
Yeah, I think the biggest, I guess, challenge with that is in a lot of cases cost. You know, where you think that something is free, it's typically not, and really being able to come to, you know, sometimes people say, hey, you should partner. The partnerships also require give and take on both sides, and to get to that particular medium, really sometimes it causes both parties to really have some sort of financial investment, not just you know, the partner that we're asking the commitment from. And so really first of all, making sure that's understood, and then coming to some type of agreement, and I would say legally, on the parameters around what it is that that will be used on those platforms, especially when it deals with the community. I think in some cases there's a lot of mistrust with some of these organizations that really have not handled data in the best way in the past from a privacy perspective. And so, I think those are some of the challenges, but we're working through them. As you probably heard me talk to on it, because I truly do believe if it's that important to you and your organization and you're that focused on it, you will work it out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gary. Our next question, how do you work on digital inclusion, digital literacy, and data privacy at the same time? I have found that our organization focuses a lot on digital inclusion, which is great, but we're perhaps missing the low-hanging fruit of people with internet access with low digital literacy. Lori, I'd love to ask you to speak to that question first.
So I think it's a combination of things. As a city and as the power of city government. Some of that comes with how we intentionally plan and look at partnerships, and how we intentionally plan and look at how we can try to move the agenda forward on the digital equity divide. And so that would mean that it's an accountability card, right? And so everyone has to be very upfront of where we are, where we stand, and what our shared goals and mission and accomplishments will be. Same time, we are charged with figuring out when there is a gap, when there is a divide, when things are not on the same playing field, how we get there, and how we get there by way of ensuring that everyone does have a voice, right? Everyone does have what they need. Everyone does have access. So it's tricky, right? It's not tricky in a bad way. It's just, there are different components that you have to weigh in on every side. And so it's an evolving process, because no one has the cookie cutter perfect, solution. But I will say that there has to be an element of trusting your team and trusting persons who lead this effort. For me, it is Chief David Elgis, who is our chief of our IT department, and his landscape and lens around how we get to those spaces is key for us as we determine even scenarios like we're in now.
Thank you, Lori. And I think we just have time for one last question, which says, please describe your digital equity efforts aimed at Black-owned small businesses. Many community-based small businesses don't have access to affordable broadband, nor do they have an online presence. During and after COVID, how will you digitally enable and accelerate community economic development? Majestic, I'd love to ask you to take that to start.
Sure. So one of the things that we understand is that a lot of our Black-owned businesses, they do business, business to consumer. They're B2C businesses. And many of them also really benefit when people are coming into the store, and their lifestyle businesses and things like that. One of the things that our Urban Redevelopment Authority was able to do really quickly, again, was pivot to be able to get folks access to websites and access to contractors and folks that could help them get online. So we were able to get a number of businesses online within the first 45 days of COVID, which was really fast. And in particular, we have a all Black woman led accelerator, if you will, or incubator in one of our traditionally Black neighborhoods that is transitioning. And what we were able to do within a week for them actually was to get them all online, because they were lifestyle businesses and we knew the challenge that was occurring. So we've been doing a good job with it. We've been looking at some models. Toronto seems to have a really strong model around getting everyone online. And it's something that we're really looking at to say, going forward, just because we know businesses will shift and things will be different, and folks can't get the same amount of people inside the stores. And we know that so many folks are, their margins are so small that we want to make sure they have a robust level of business. So we're looking to scale the example that I gave with the all Black woman led incubator, and then also with some other broader businesses. We were invested a couple $100,000, but now we're really looking to scale that in some of our next investments.
Great, thank you, Majestic. Well, I know we are at time, although I'm sure Gary and Lori could speak to that question as well. So I just want to thank you all again so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And to our attendees, we hope you'll all join us tomorrow for the next session in our series on shared accountability, the public-private partnership, which is something that came up a number of times today. So I'm excited to dig into that further tomorrow. And that session will be held from 12 to 1:30 p.m. So thank you again so much for joining, and thanks for a great discussion.